For more on the historic climate conference, we're joined by Paul Bledsoe. He's president of Bledsoe Associates. He's a senior fellow climate change and energy program at the German Marshall Fund. Thank you and welcome to the broadcast.
My pleasure.
We were just saying that UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has said the current pledges do not achieve the goal of holding the increase in global temperature to 2 degrees Celsius. So where does that leave the focus of the talks?
Well, it's important to note that right now we're on a trajectory for temperature increases of almost 4 degrees Celsius, which could cause enormous climate impacts around the world. If we get the agreement here in Paris from the commitments we have so far from major nations, we would limit warming to 2.7 degrees Celsius, so a full degree less. And that's the difference between 500 million people facing long-term sea level rise inundation and maybe over only 200 million. So sparing 300 million people from sea level rise. And that's just the kind of difference that getting an agreement will make versus not getting one.
Well, China is still doing important work regarding this, and despite the economic downturn, what kind of influence does it have over the developing countries who are also the large emitters, and you know who they are, like Brazil, India, and South Africa?
Of course, China has an enormous role to play as a model for how a developing economy can grow, have strong economic growth, and develop a middle class, and still reduce its emissions long term. China's made very large investments in renewables, in nuclear, and in energy efficiency. They're moving toward carbon pricing at a national level, which would be a very important step. And so China can really be a model for the rest of the developing world about how to have a strong economy and reduce emissions. However, China needs to agree to a strong monitoring and verification regime here in Paris. They need to be transparent about their emissions levels so that the rest of the world can be sure they're actually meeting their pledges.
Paul, as you know, 20 years ago, the U.S. did not sign that climate deal in Kyoto. Some developed countries are actually blaming the developing countries for the holdup on signing this deal. How much faith do other countries have in the West at this point?
I think the West, I know the president personally wants a deal very much. He believes it's in the U.S. national interest, and I believe that's true of the EU leaders. Certainly the French have shown great leadership. I actually think that most world leaders now recognize that climate change is an existential problem that threatens their stability and economies, and they really do want a deal. The key is, do we get the kind of deal that can last and really matter? I think it's quite important, for example, that we reiterate negotiations and set new levels of ambition every 5 years. So a 2025 agreement will be revisited in 2030 and so on. I think that's very important to continue to ratchet down emissions so that we can limit warming under 2 degrees C and protect global populations. You know, the Paris attacks have put enormous pressure on world leaders to deliver on an urgent global problem of importance to populations around the world, and that's what's at stake here.
Paul, what would a successful agreement look like? Is there any way to detail that for us, or we should say, what's likely to happen?
I think we will get an agreement here in Paris, and it will have 4 main features. The first is every major nation will take a pledge to meet or exceed their already made emissions pledges. In the United States, it's a very large emissions pledge, 26% below 2005 levels by 2025. Other nations, including China, have agreed to cap their emissions. That's the first thing. So nations have to agree and have to follow through on those. To make sure they meet those targets, we have to have monitoring and verification regimes that can ensure that countries are really cutting their emissions. Third, we have to come up with a very strong package of financing to help major growing countries like India, Brazil, and others to reduce their emissions in a climate-friendly way, principally by deploying clean energy technologies. And the final thing is that we have to recognize that we're not going to solve this problem in one agreement. There are other ways to get emissions reductions, including through the Montreal Protocol by cutting HFCs, by addressing black carbon, methane, and other gases. So Paris is the critical step in climate protection, but we have to do much else, including, you'll see from Bill Gates and other major private investors tomorrow, a pledge to make investments themselves in clean energy. It's really an all-hands-on-deck moment, but I believe we're going to come up with a Paris Agreement that will set the world toward a safer, more secure climate.
Well, Paul Bledsoe, we really appreciate you joining us live in Paris.